Stop the world!
We realize what an incredibly important part of our future the Indo-Pacific is. If you look at our trade flows, the future of our prosperity, our economic flows, also some of our key partners, from economic security to technologies, they are here in this region.
Welcome back to Stop the World, ASPI's weekly podcast on international affairs and security. I'm Steph Tiller. In this episode, the European External Action Service's Managing Director for Asia and the Pacific, Niclas Kvarnström, joins senior ASPI analyst Alex Bristow to discuss the European Union's relationship with the Indo-Pacific. With war in Europe and conflict in the Middle East, they discuss how much bandwidth the European Union has to focus on the Indo-Pacific, how Russia's war in Ukraine has forced a rethink of the EU's future security, as well as its relationship with China. Alex also asks Niclas about scepticism of the EU as a security actor in the Indo-Pacific.
To that, I would say that in precisely this type of security environment that you have now with the geopolitical tensions, certain fundamental principles of international law being questioned and so on, the European Union is a very good, logical complement to the security architecture in the broader Indo-Pacific.
And later in the episode, Alex is joined by William Leben, an expert associate at the Australian National University's National Security College and the author of an ASPI report on escalation risks in the Indo-Pacific. They discuss the main threats to strategic stability in the Indo-Pacific, how a potential crisis in the region might develop, and whether AUKUS will contribute to a balance of power in the region or have the opposite effect.
A range of the capabilities that we're set to acquire under the auspices of AUKUS, whether you agree with these decisions as parts of Australia's strategic policy or not, have implications for crisis stability because of the kinds of weapons we're acquiring.
But for now, let's get into the conversation with Alex and Niclas.
Welcome to the ASPI podcast, Stop the World. My name's Alex Bristow, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Ambassador Niclas Kvarnström. I hope my Swedish pronunciation is somewhat close to accurate there.
That's excellent. Yeah.
And Niclas, you are the Managing Director for the Asia Pacific from the European External Action Service, which my British understanding of EU institutions is that that's somewhat like the Foreign Ministry in the EU. Thanks for joining us today, Niclas. You're one of many senior people from the EEAS who's been coming recently. We had the EU envoy for the Indo-Pacific, Richard Tibbles, in Canberra recently. So obviously, this is all evidence that the EU and Europe at large is paying a lot of attention to our region and to Australia, which is fantastic. Of course, there's always a million good reasons to come to Australia, but what's your main driver for coming on this occasion?
Well, first of all, Alex, great to be on the podcast and excellent that you focus a little bit on us in Europe. Let's hope I don't contradict Richard or vice versa. But, you know, the main reason of coming here, I mean, by the way, this is a trip that I did. I came from Fiji and Vanuatu coming here. But one reason is, of course, that Australia is across the board one of our very most important and closest partners across the border policy issues in Asia Pacific, in the Indo-Pacific. And so it is about having deeper, closer cooperation and a dialogue on the big strategic issues that we face with Australia. But beyond that, we had a trilateral also with Australia and New Zealand on our Pacific policy. And, you know, I had bilaterals with Fiji and Vanuatu. So it was also an opportunity to understand a little bit more about the regional dynamic in the Pacific.
Well, you may have noticed that the maps in Australia are a little bit different to the ones in Europe. Australia's fair and square in the middle. But however you cut the map, obviously, the Indo-Pacific is still quite a long way from Europe. I guess viewed simplistically, Europe does seem to have quite a lot on its plate at the moment. War has unfortunately returned to Europe, and we're all supporting Ukraine in their resistance against Russia's aggression. There's also conflict in the Middle East and fears that could escalate anytime soon. And I know that Europe's involved in several ways, including in the maritime security effort in the Red Sea. It just sort of feels like Europe's got a lot of fires to fight near to home. How much capacity does Europe have, and the EU specifically, I guess, in this region, in the Indo-Pacific? What would you expect the EU to be able to deliver here?
Well, thank you. And I mean, first of all, I'm a map nerd. I like maps, so it's nice to look at one from a new perspective. And geography is what it is. It will not go away. But I would say a couple of things. First of all, the world is smaller than it used to be. It is because we're interconnected in new ways. You can talk about cyber, you can talk about trade flows and so on. And for Europe, when it comes to the Indo-Pacific, it's a lot closer than I think it's tempting to think of it. What I mean by that is that one of the reasons that we have the European Indo-Pacific strategy is we realize what an incredibly important part of our future the Indo-Pacific is. If you look at our trade flows, the future of our prosperity, our economic flows, also some of our key partners from economic security to technologies, they are here in this region. And we know that a large part of the growth for the European Union in the years to come will come here. So that's one reason to focus on it. The other one is that we really live in a time where security between the Euro-Atlantic space and the Indo-Pacific is more closely linked than they perhaps have been for a very, very long time. And that means that, Australia, for example, we are extremely grateful for Australia's commitment to the UN Charter and support for the sovereignty, territorial integrity of Ukraine and standing up for Ukraine against Russia's illegal war of aggression. Equally, we share together with our partners in the region, and it's a growing number of partners, I would say, an interest in a rules-based approach to trade, to connectivity, to how we meet global challenges like sustainable development in the region. And on your point, of course, it's true that the political bandwidth, I think this is a global phenomenon. We have a full-blown illegal war of aggression in our continent, Russia's war against Ukraine. We have a crisis in the Middle East, which is right on Europe's doorstep. But it's not only is it the case that we still realize that we have to have the long-term perspective on this region, on the Indo-Pacific, for all the reasons I mentioned. But in addition, it's not really going to be possible for us to address fully challenges like the war, Russia's war, or the Middle East without very close dialogue with our partners in this region. And, I'm proud to say that we found the time in the middle of the ongoing Middle East crisis and on meetings related to Ukraine to host our Indo-Pacific Ministerial Forum with some 70 countries represented in the EU, a special day on the Pacific in the European Parliament, and of course our ministerial meeting with ASEAN. So it does show that we are capable of realizing the long-term objectives and also the importance of this region for what's going on immediately.
Thank you. And there were some periodic reports, I think, on your key strategies showing how you delivered on them. And obviously your inaugural Indo-Pacific strategy was, 2021?
21, yeah.
And I think you did sort of an update on that towards the end of last year. And I was looking through some of the evidence of delivery. And actually there were quite a lot of activities in there that I didn't realize the EU was engaged in. So, for example, there's a maritime security initiative in this region. I'm not sure how well known some of those are. And I think when particular European countries come through the region, and I think we're expecting the French to come through with their aircraft carrier maybe next year, that can get quite a lot of attention. And often the ADF here will go and join those operations with those partner countries. But the EU as a security actor in this region, I think, doesn't get a tremendous amount of attention. There's a lot of Chinese propaganda about NATO coming into this region and what their ambitions might be. But the EU seems to go under the radar a little bit. Are there particular areas of that contribution to security assistance where you would see the EU having a real niche?
Well, first of all, on the list of what the EU is doing in the region, I have to confess I did joke with my predecessor that the sort of 9-page press release that we did at the last in the Stockholm Indo-Pacific Ministerial Forum, that we were the only two readers of that. Obviously, we have to get very good at how we present all the things that we do. But the truth is that if you look at all the action, the external action of the European Union, from trade and free trade agreements to the landmark Samoa agreement that we signed now with the ACP countries, to the security sphere, some of our global gateway projects and so on. The list is actually very long, substantial and growing. On the security, I know exactly what you mean because I've been to quite a number of, for example, Shangri-La dialogues in the different jobs that I've had. And over the years, the perhaps skepticism sometimes in the region of the European Union as a security actor in the Indo-Pacific. But to that, I would say that in precisely this type of security environment that you have now with the geopolitical tensions, certain fundamental principles of international law being questioned and so on, the European Union is a very good logical complement to the security architecture in the broader Indo-Pacific. Why I say that is that we are, of course, an actor, first of all, with no hidden agenda. There's a lot of talk about being forced to take sides and so on. We are about common principles that we operate together with our partners. Secondly, I think, we have a broad and long experience of crisis management. We have sophisticated, world-leading, in many cases, defense industries. We're very, very good at the new threats like cyber, hybrid, FEMI, and we are finding increasingly interest on that also here in Australia and in many of our partner countries. So from that point of view, I think the European Union is an attractive addition. I mean, some of our member states have aircraft carriers and partaking in exercises.
Only one of your member states has an aircraft carrier.
Sorry,
now.
Italy does.
Oh, Italy. Oh, apologies. Sorry.
It depends.
Sorry, Italy.
It depends exactly what type of air, but yes.
Okay.
So there you go. We have a coordinated maritime presence. We do exercises. We have 2 military missions, ASPI and Atalanta, that have had interactions and exercises with others. Crimario and the platform IORIS is one that's very appreciated in the region for maritime domain awareness. And I was, again, as I mentioned, coming from the Pacific island states, and some of them are using this platform, and I think it's quite a sophisticated one. And again, true to the EU sort of model, the EU is not inside every conversation. It's a system that's open and quite sophisticated. We also have an initiative called ESIWA, and not to bore you with all the acronyms, because in Europe we really love acronyms.
I remember that.
But again, it is a very good platform for security partnerships, for example, on cyber between ourselves, partner countries, and we can even have other third-party actors as part of it.
Fantastic. Well, obviously, Europe has tremendous experience of dealing with some of these hybrid threats, largely, I guess, from proximity to Russia. But of course, proximity isn't required to be on the receiving end of many of the hybrid threats we now face, such as technology-enabled, cyber-enabled threats like disinformation and those sorts of things. And I know ASPI is very happy to have a partnership with the EU looking at some of these hybrid threats. I know ASPI has published previously looking at the centres of excellence that you have in Europe that can help build resilience to some of these threats. I think there's one in Helsinki where the EU is one of the partners that's funding that. And I think NATO has other centres of excellence in the Baltic states and areas like cyber. No, I think that's a really good point to make, that's a contribution where the EU has a lot of competence, and ASPI's happy to be part of a series of 4 think tanks that are funded by NATO to look at the links between Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic security. One of the things that's always come across in the meetings I've had in Europe as part of that initiative is that we tend to think of security as, in the European context, as something that NATO does. But actually the EU, if you look at Ukraine, is making a real contribution. In some ways, it's almost a shield and spear scenario where I think NATO has made sure that deterrence is maintained for the member states of NATO, that Russia is not going to hopefully push its luck across the border into a NATO member. But actually a lot of the offensive work that we've done to help Ukraine, a lot of that's been organised through the EU. So the fundraising, the mechanisms to get defence industry operating properly, many of which are, it's taken a long while, but it is starting to yield fruit. I think a lot of that's come through the EU. So I think we sometimes miss that when we look at European security from afar. We should come back to the hybrid threats in a bit, but I did want to just touch a bit on China first. I really enjoyed reading the 2022 Strategic Compass, which includes some very candid language on the challenges that are posed by China for Europe. And it also talks about a need for Europe to work with partners around the world to respond to those challenges. I forget the precise wording, but China is a partner and a systemic competitor, isn't it? I think in the language that's chosen in the Strategic Compass. I think every country struggles to get relations with China, absolutely right. It's very difficult to do. I know that, obviously Australia is currently pursuing a policy of stabilization, having gone through a period of being on the receiving end of Chinese coercion. And there are critics of that and constant debate here about how well the relationship can develop from here. I was wondering about your view about the balancing act that Europe and the member states within Europe have to play on this whenever there's a big visit to Europe. I mean, for example, German Chancellor Scholz recently went to Beijing. This dilemma seems to be brought to the fore quite clearly, that on the one hand, China is Europe's second biggest trading partner overall. Is that accurate? It's
third, I think. Yeah,
third. Okay, but for some countries like Germany, really a huge trading partner. And so it's explicit in the rhetoric of leaders when they travel to Beijing, and obviously that travel has resumed, that trade is an important part of why they're there. They sometimes go with trade missions behind them, but also to Chancellor Scholz's credit, he also made it clear that he was there to discuss concerns over Beijing's economic coercion and their support for Russia's illegal war in Ukraine. So I don't know if you sort of feel that Europe is getting it right at the moment, and whether there's any tension between what the member states are doing and what Europe as a whole is trying to achieve.
Yeah, thank you. I will not, just you think I'm not dodging the China question, I'll get to that, but if you allow, I'll just say a couple of words on what you said on security, because I think it's quite interesting from our perspective. First of all, I'd like to say I think Russia's illegal war of aggression against Ukraine has been in so many ways a fundamental moment for Europe to reflect on its security and our future security, and the role that all the different components in the European security architecture would play. I come from Sweden, part of Europe, the Nordic Baltic region, where I think perhaps on FEMI stuff, disinformation, influence operations, hybrid and cyber and so on has been very, very exposed. So I think early on in Europe, because of what Russia has been doing to us, we've been exposed to it. We've developed a lot of expertise. In today's world, you can have threats emanating from another region that hits you in your region. And the unfortunate thing is that actors who want to undermine things in our systems, I think sometimes we've gone from trying to spread democracy and human rights and so on to actually defending them in our own societies. And actors not only can it be very sinister in terms of trying to create splits, not just between allies and partners, but within societies, but they are learning from each other. So there's a playbook, and it's our job, I think, to keep up with the playbook and as societies, rally across the board to meet this. And I think that's a work that Europe has been doing, including the European Union. And then to the point of the European Union in security, security today, NATO, you mentioned NATO is a military alliance, but a lot of security today is in that zone, by the way, also economic security and so on. In all these areas, the European Union plays a very important role for the member states and for our institutions. Now to China, on that, I think the phrase, the sort of the catchphrase, the summary, the joke that is called sometimes the Holy Trinity or the triptych, but it's that, viewing China simultaneously as a partner, a competitor, and a systemic rival. The Chinese are very fond of saying, oh, that's like a traffic light with all three, in green, red, and amber on it all at the same time. But in all honesty, between the main geopolitical actors of the world, it's always going to be like that. You're going to have areas where you can cooperate, and then areas which essentially translate into things we have to protect or things that we have to look after. Within that, I would say for the EU, we have been, I think, it starts with engagement, and you couldn't say that we could be more engaged. We had something like 8 commissioners visiting China. I was also part of the delegation going to China in December for the summit with the 2 presidents from the EU, and Xi Jinping and Li Qiang, the president and prime minister of China.
Who's coming here soon.
Who's coming, that's right. And so I think what we are doing is, as you mentioned, for many of our member states and for the EU as a whole, as is the case for Australia, as is the case for the US or Japan, China is one of our most important economic counterparts. So it's very important to have that face-to-face discussion on the principles that we conduct that cooperation under. And so, we're trying to help our companies grow, but above all, to have a level playing field. And I think when you have, I think there are 2 sort of landscape features with China, and we do see all these visits now. You mentioned a chancellor's visit. There will be a visit incoming, we think, to Paris and so on from Xi Jinping. In this, it's important for the European Union as a geopolitical actor to be clear, to be credible. Clear meaning that we have to discuss the difficult bits. It is not acceptable for the EU to ignore these economic imbalances, whether or not you're talking about the massive trade deficit that has been going up, recently went down a little bit, probably. There's a separate analysis on that, but it's still massive. And then the overcapacities of the Chinese economy, which will hit us. And it comes from dealing with a completely different actor. For the European Union, it's very important that we operate under WTO rules. We are transparent and so on, but we're also very clear when we think that we don't have a level playing field. On top of that, there is Russia, and I think for the European Union, Russia's illegal war of aggression, the full-scale invasion, is an existential threat for us. Can't highlight that enough in terms of the European security architecture, in terms of the fact that, we are standing by the very, very core principles of the UN Charter. And in the long run, by the way, and this will be a unifying project, I think, for the European Union, albeit extremely difficult, to rebuild Ukraine. And in all this, the European Union is China's largest trading partner, and it's really important for us to know where we have them. And the problem is that quite apart from amplifying some of the Russian narratives and so on that are frankly, outright lies, we have the de facto situation that China in various ways, that's where Russia goes to have the wherewithal to continue this war. So that is a conversation we have to have. And if our Chinese partners are serious about being balanced, it cannot be that all the cost for this balanced policy falls on us and none on Russia. And so we really would like them to listen to us very sincerely when we talk about the global security order, the European Union security, and so on. So back to the kind of the traffic light and so on, I think we will not shy away from having these very frank conversations, but we will always do that with a spirit of engagement. By the way, being out here in the Indo-Pacific region, there are potential conflicts out here that would very, very much impact European Union security, prosperity, and our relationships with our key partners. And we're not shy about saying that this is a concern for us. So there you have a relationship that we also do the de-risking agenda, which I think all the major actors in the world are doing. That's about looking at excessive dependencies, excessive vulnerabilities, resilient supply chains, and so on. The good news is that once you have decided what it is you de-risk, you have also defined the very large, I would say, space that you have for cooperation.
I think this is going to have to be our final question, unfortunately, but you did mention de-risking, and we said we would return to hybrid threats, and obviously one of the forms of hybrid aggressive activity that China has certainly been using is economic coercion. Some European countries like Lithuania have been at the sharp end of Chinese sharp power in this regard. Australia has also experienced economic coercion and continues to. In fact, not all the trade restrictions have yet been lifted. The EU seems to have really taken this to heart and has come up with a series of responses, including a new economic security strategy. And you're in good company. Lots of countries around the world have put forward their own versions. And you have a new anti-coercion instrument, which I think has just come into effect, if I'm right, which I understand that as trying to make sure there's a collective response to, if there's a state actor like China that's trying to target one of your members, that there would be a collective response. How do you see this economic security agenda, these anti-coercion initiatives, how do you see those complementing what's going on a global stage? So the G7 is involved in anti-coercion work. I mean, on the economic security, we had Prime Minister Albanese here making a speech recently on future made in Australia, which I'm not sure I would have gone with that terminology because it sounds a little bit like made in China 2025. But future made in Australia, as I understand it, is what is explicitly actually put in the context of some of the economic security work that other countries are doing. I think Albanese said, this is not protectionism or isolationism. This is the new competition that we have to be playing this. We have to be playing this game. So how does what the EU is doing complement what countries like Australia are doing, what the G7's doing, Japan's doing? And is there any risk that we overcompensate and we do start to hamper the vitality of our open markets or open economies?
I think it's a good question. I think that for all of us, and especially the European Union, which is, founded on these principles like free trade, we have to, of course, always be careful that we don't end up in a kind of race to the bottom, sort of negative downward spiral of protectionism. But I do think the EU is quite careful about playing it by the book, so to say, and always looking after, is this actually truly a level playing field or not? It is true, I think you mentioned the future made in Australia, right?
Yes, that's right.
I mean, we live in a time where I think that is, you will find versions of that sort of concept in many, many states, markets, institutions, and it is about everyone trying to look after their, rightfully, the jobs and the situation for taxpayers. But we have to be careful that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to say, in terms of the benefits of free trade. In terms of, I think one space where you mentioned the anti-coercion instrument, and one space where these things overlap in terms of economic security strategy, broadly I talked about the avoiding excessive dependencies and so on, and where we stand up, because the EU ultimately is a solidarity project, a peace project based on the understanding that through shared economic prosperity and economic security comes peace, comes cooperation. And I think with our partners, whether it's in the G7 or partners through the Indo-Pacific strategy, we are trying to offer cooperation on those terms, meaning it's transparent, it's clean, it is based on free trade, rule of law, and those principles. Not only is it the case that there are many, many actors, many of our partners, including Australia, who care about that, but also that if there's a significant amount of states across the globe who feel, despite having different systems perhaps among ourselves and so on, that these rules of the road for free trade, for respect for the UN Charter rule of law, that if we together form a meshwork, it will be very, very difficult for major actors who want to sort of impose or foist their agenda on us to do that. So the economic security strategy, and the EU is not a nation state. We have 27 member states, so a lot of the implementation will be up to them. But it is a very ambitious first part of defining the things that we need to be mindful of for our own security, not to do it in a protectionist way, but to do it in a way that ensures transparency, level playing field, and that we have learned from our experiences, I think, both COVID and Russia and others, in a place that ends up being a threatened security situation for us, really. So we're looking for partners, and what better place to start than Australia?
Excellent. Well, thanks, Niclas. I'm sure you'll find many partners here, and do enjoy the rest of your time in Australia and enjoy the long flight back to Europe.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being on the show and particularly being here in Australia. So it's been a great experience. Thanks very much.
Thanks.
Up next, Alex and William explore the ASPI report, Escalation Risks in the Indo-Pacific, a review for practitioners. If you're interested in finding out more about the report, we'll link to it in the episode notes.
Really happy to be joined here today by Will Leben, who is formerly an Australian military officer and presently Expert Associate of the National Security College, which is part of the Australian National University. And I'm very proud to say, Will, we've known each other for a long time because you were also formerly at ASPI. I like to say that ASPI is a little bit like the mafia, the Godfather reference, where, just when you thought you were out, we haul you back in, and we have successfully hauled you back into the building today. So today's discussion, we were going to sort of segue off a report you wrote for us recently, which everybody should read if you haven't already, about escalation risks in the Indo-Pacific. It's very timely, I think, given some of the discussions that are going on, including the ASEAN Special Summit in Melbourne and some of the remarks by the Foreign Minister there. But let's start off perhaps with the actual terminology. Ministers, including obviously Foreign Minister Wong, talk about concepts like strategic equilibrium in the Indo-Pacific. But what do you think deterrence theorists and policy practitioners, who I think are the policy practitioners in particular are the focus of your work, what do they mean when they use the term strategic stability, which is obviously in your report?
Thanks, Alex. It's great to be here and it's great to see you. So we can pull apart a bunch of different parts of this concept, and we should note at the outset that there's a lot of disagreement both within the scholarship and within the practitioner community on these questions. What I intend by the term, which is probably the safest ground to stay on, and what I am interested in exploring in this report and I think is important for Australia, is stability in the sense of what we can expect out of crises and how crises might develop. So there is language in a broader sense around strategic stability, which might refer to the relative balance between states and how actors are behaving in a bigger hand sense of the term or the concept. What I'm most interested in is how particular military situations might play out, the incentives that might be available to decision makers, the implications of particular pieces of equipment, particular doctrines and so on. And that might sound quite down in the weeds and granular and technical, but ultimately it has really important implications for what the risks look like of conflict and the extent to which the decisions that national leaders and operational leaders might make explicitly and deliberately, how controllable the implications of those decisions are and how well understood they are.
Great. And, your report is subtitled A Review for Practitioners. You've mentioned perhaps two types of practitioners there. Are those the audience you have in mind, national leaders making decisions in crisis and people at the operational level, presumably in institutions like the military? Yeah,
absolutely. So I make a few comments in the report and the recommendations of the report about what might be seen as micromanagement, but in historical perspective simply isn't, both because it's been historical practice and because of the significance of the decisions we're talking about. So decisions to use particular types of military force or to make particular deployments, to send a ship somewhere, for instance, or how to use a battle group that might be on land, those are operational military decisions, and in an operational sense will be made by military leaders. Their significance is such in any situation, but particularly in one where there might be questions of wider war or conflict, that the highest level leaders are involved. And in the Australian context, that obviously means the National Security Committee of Cabinet and the Prime Minister. And it's appropriate that they understand to a level of detail which might seem surprising to some people about how those decisions are actually operationalised and the risks built into them.
Excellent. I do particularly enjoy the way you draw on history in your report and also bring out some of the unique features of our maritime environment that we're operating in here and how that might differ from some of the lessons of history that we look at in places like Europe. So focusing on our region, on the Indo-Pacific, what are the main threats to strategic stability and how might a crisis develop and escalate?
So I might deal with those in reverse and talk first to the potential sources of crises and then the reasons we might be concerned about how controllable or stable those situations would be. So in terms of the sources of crisis, the most obvious in the Australian discourse, with probably an undue degree of prominence from my point of view, is obviously a contingency over Taiwan. That being presumably a deliberate action in the first instance to use force against Taiwan, or in a broader suite of possibilities, an accident surrounding military assets, vessels at sea, a collision of aircraft in the air, or the positioning of assets on the island by a Western partner, obviously the United States, or parallel movements by the Chinese government of military force around the region, which might be misinterpreted. Like I say, though, that's not an expansive view of how these things might develop in terms of sources of crises. Elsewhere in the region, an obvious source is the Korean Peninsula, either some kind of crisis internal to the regime, which results in instability on the peninsula, or international miscalculation. For instance, the regime saber rattling a little bit too much and misreading an American appetite to respond, a loss of control of military force on one side of the demilitarized zone, resulting in shooting, which has occurred in the past, and that not staying under control. Militarized disputes of various stripes in the East and South China Sea making up another obvious basket of potential sources. Everybody is familiar, at least at the macro level, with the disputed features and the ongoing tensions around those features in both the East and South China Seas. And again, here we might be talking about either the deliberate use of force with the expectation that it wouldn't provoke a response, or it would provoke a certain kind of response, or alternately an accident which is misread or provides pretext for further escalation. Again, things like vessels at sea, accidents in the air, or completely unforeseeable catastrophes, which, again, there is significant historical precedent for, although it seems like a black box to say, well, we can't foresee these things. But there are ample historical case studies to suggest that there's a whole suite of these things that might lead in really dark directions.
You've obviously built on the work of others, including Brendan Taylor at ANU and his concept of flashpoints in the region. And I think Brendan also makes the point about, the focus on Taiwan might distract us from some of the other sources of tension. Maybe just keeping on the maritime for a second, I think we alluded to it earlier in the discussion. I think a really interesting part of your report for me was just challenging the assumption that maritime environments are relatively easy to de-escalate from. I think you're less persuaded by that argument. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And so this links to the previous question, and that goes to how crises might escalate. And conceptually, I think it's useful to think about that under three headings, that being miscalculation in terms of deliberately taking an action and not understanding the implications of it or how it might be read. Preemption, the pressures that a state or a military leader or a national leader might feel to take an action in order to avoid their own loss. And completely inadvertent actions through accident or an unknown in the way that a system functions. Now, how that functions at sea is unique in some ways, at least viz how we usually think about these crises in terms of historical case studies, being World War I, to a lesser extent World War II, the Cuban crisis to some extent, but this is a distinctly maritime theatre with a set of actors and technologies which have their own character in our time. In terms of maritime domain characteristics, it has been suggested that because forces can be withdrawn easily, because they're mobile, that this creates a situation where the incentives to escalate are actually restrained. I think there are very good reasons to be skeptical of that. We can point to a number of specific technologies about why that might be the case. There's ambiguity in these forces. You don't know what's in a vertical launch cell, the way that modern warships, both American, Allied, Australian, Chinese, of any stripe, launch missiles. It is a black box in the sense that you don't know whether there is a strike missile in that cell or something that is geared purely for self-defense.
Or what the warhead is on top of the,
and you don't
depending
know
on who's firing.
And you don't know, depending on who was firing it, you don't know what the warhead on top of that missile is. There's an expression that modern warships have glass jaws, in the sense that even if the warship might not be lost in a total loss sense, there's a very high or very good and realistic chance that a warship will be disabled with one good hit, and that creates very strong preemption pressures. And all of these systems interact with a nuclear balance, which is pretty poorly understood, at least in the public domain. And that's for understandable reasons. This sits in the domain of discrete and sensitive intelligence agencies, but has implications for the way that we make strategic policy and manage risk, which unavoidably, I should say, bleeds into the public domain.
I wouldn't say it solely sits in the realm of the intelligence agencies. Obviously, at ASPI, you've had a proud heritage of the likes of Rod Lyon publishing extensively on nuclear strategy, just to show that there's someone who's from New Zealand can do nuclear issues. Just while we're focusing on this region, let's bring it even closer to home to Australia. With the events we've already mentioned, this is being recorded at the time of the ASEAN Special Summit in Melbourne. What can countries that are less powerful, like Australia, the countries of Southeast Asia, what can they do to improve strategic stability? And the flip side of that, is there anything that these countries, including Australia, are doing that might be destabilising the region?
So I think it's important to acknowledge at the outset that major powers, and in particular nuclear powers, are the major players in this space. And there's no pretense in this work that that's anything other than the case. Nonetheless, second tier, third tier players, whatever language we want to use around middle powers, are significant. To cite a historical example of why this is important in a very acute sense, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was Cuban ground forces shooting at American spy planes when there was relative restraint being exercised by Russian, Soviet and American forces. The third-party contribution to these dynamics can be really significant.
In the Taiwan Straits crisis in the 50s, I think it was largely about restraining Chiang Kai-shek.
The incentives of the third party or a fourth and fifth party might be very contra those of the major players who are acutely minded of the catastrophic risks of the weapons that they operate. Could Australia do something destabilising or provocative? Well, it could, like any country could. So the first thing that we can do when understanding how we go about making our own decisions and using capability is understanding the implications of those deployments. And some of the recommendations I make in the report go to that. So the easiest place to start in terms of mitigation, escalation control, to the extent that we can influence these questions, is to get our own house in order. Again, to the extent to which these things are black boxes, no doubt there is due focus and awareness of these questions within parts of the national security community in Australia, people within the Department of Defence who think very deeply about how to actually operationalise concepts like deterrence, and there's no claim that those people are naive or blind to these issues. But we need as much investment as possible, and there is good reason, including commentary from people who've lived within these parts of government for large parts of their career, that muscle memory, shall we say, has atrophied relative to earlier phases of Australian history where there were more live questions.
Including in think tanks, I think.
Yeah. So we need due investment both in government and external to government, both because historically external to government, the sources of thinking on these issues has been hugely influential, and because there needs to be a public part of the conversation.
And just that Melbourne segue, I know you've been studying Foreign Minister Wong's remarks over the last couple of days. I assume you take a slightly different view of them than former Prime Minister Keating did. It was a rather ungenerous view, but this concept of safeguards, I'm not sure if that's actually the term she's still using, but she is clearly signalling that countries in Southeast Asia and Australia should be working together to stabilise the region. Is there anything worth drawing out from what you've seen her say?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Foreign Minister, whose focus on this issue and under the language of guardrails has been very clear throughout her tenure in office, which is fantastic and appropriate. The language you saw on Monday included phrases like preventative architecture. Now, what that looks like in practice is difficult, both because these are really difficult issues and because some of it does sit within the sensitive parts of government. Well, what can we do? In the first instance, we can talk to each other. Now, that doesn't make these problems go away, and there's a risk that that kind of suggestion is regarded by a cop-out by people who see themselves as more hard-headed. For a start, because countries make decisions about relative risk thresholds, accept risk, make threats of force, and that's part of how militaries are used, how strategy is done. So these channels for communication can always be deployed to those ends, manipulated, abused, if you will. Nonetheless, there's broad recognition across people who understand these issues that having mechanisms for dialogue is critical, both between the major powers, and the Foreign Minister commended the resumption of military and national level dialogue, or the resumption of that dialogue between the US and China this week, and also among players in the region. So when, for instance, an accident does happen, communication is readily at hand and people aren't projecting a view of what has occurred that is simply inaccurate. And those things, while they don't absolve the risk built into these kind of weapons, they still go some significant way to reducing the risk.
I was maybe going to just do a different pivot to what I sometimes unfunnily call the A-bomb, which is AUKUS. Is there anything that Australia is doing, and it's in partnership in AUKUS, that has implications for strategic stability, and anything that Australia can be doing to make sure that that's, I think the terminology used by Richard Miles is contributing to balance of power in the region, which sounds like a good thing, rather than having the opposite effect?
Yeah, there's absolutely a tie-in, and I think that's part of what makes this work relevant at this point in time and means it's a conversation we need to continue having over coming decades. A range of the capabilities that we're set to acquire under the auspices of AUKUS, whether you agree with these decisions as parts of Australia's strategic policy or not, have implications for crisis stability because of the kinds of weapons we're acquiring. So most obviously nuclear-powered attack submarines, but also the development of hypersonic weapons, travel very fast and have significant implications for preemption pressure because your time to make decisions is massively truncated. Cyber weapons, offensive cyber tools, and how they interact with a country's command and control architecture and their ability to understand what's going on, how those weapons also interact with space-based sensors and decision-making. These are all parts of the military balance that are touched on by the capabilities being developed under AUKUS, and we really need to take a serious view of how they might interact with each other in the region as we acquire them, because they're not traditionally the kind of tools that Australian decision makers have had to think through.
Yeah, and I should say there's a lot more on those issues in the report for people who are interested by this discussion. Thank you for tolerating my bad jokes there, Will. And maybe just as a final point, it's worth saying that some of those capabilities that Australia's acquiring with its partners, I think, countries like China and Russia and others that are also acquiring very similar capabilities, probably with less transparency.
Yeah, and I make the caveat at the outset of this report unapologetically that this is a report focused, to borrow the military jargon, on the blue.
The blue team.
The blue team. This is about how we operate our own capabilities and in the first instance understand our own contribution to these dynamics.
Yep.
It is of course not the whole picture. These things are necessarily interactive, and what potential adversaries might do in a crisis situation is obviously a huge part of the equation, and how they approach questions of stability and risk management prior to that, in terms of willingness to resume dialogue, establish mechanisms, their level of transparency about their weapon systems and so on, are inextricably a part of this. And no Australian or even American action by itself can solve these problems.
Thanks very much for coming in, Will. Great discussion.
Thanks, Alex.
That's all we have for you this week on Stop the World. If you have any feedback on the new podcast, we'd love to hear from you at podcast@aspi.org.au. And as always, be sure to follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening.